Chapter 17, Part 2 of An Antarctic Mystery, or the Sphinx of the Icefields. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 17, Part 2, and Pym. At length, moved by irresistible impulse, I said, "My friends, before any decision is made, let us carefully consider the situation. Should we not lay up everlasting regret for ourselves if we were to abandon our expedition at the very moment when it promises to succeed? Reflect upon this, captain, and you, my companions. It is less than 7 months since Patterson left your countrymen alive on Tsalal Island. If they were there then, the fact proves that for 11 years they have been enabled to exist on the resources provided by the island, having nothing to fear from the islanders, some of whom had fallen victim to circumstances unknown to us, and others had probably transferred themselves to some neighbouring island. This is quite plain, and I do not see how any objection can be raised to my reasoning." No one made answer. There was none to be made. "If we have not come across the captain of the Jane and his people," I resumed, "it is because they have been obliged to abandon Tsalal Island since Patterson's departure. Why? In my belief it was because the earthquake had rendered the island uninhabitable. Now they would only have required a native boat to gain either another island or some point of the Antarctic continent by the aid of the southern current. I hardly hesitate to assert that all this has occurred. But in any case, I know, and I repeat, that we shall have done nothing if we do not persevere in the search on which the safety of your countrymen depends." I questioned my audience by a searching look. No answer. Captain Len Guy, whose emotion was unrestrained, bowed his head, for he felt that I was right, that by invoking the duties of humanity I was prescribing the only course open to men with feeling hearts. "And what is in question?" I continued, after the silent pause. "To accomplish a few degrees of latitude, and that while the sea is open, while we have 2 months of good weather to look for, and nothing to fear from the southern winter. I certainly should not ask you to brave its severity. And shall we hesitate, when the Halbrane is abundantly furnished, her crew complete and in good health? Shall we take fright at imaginary dangers? Shall we not have courage to go on thither?" And I pointed to the southern horizon. Dirk Peters pointed to it also, with an imperative gesture which spoke for him. Still the eyes of all were fixed upon us, but there was no response. I continued to urge every argument, and to quote every example in favour of the safety of pursuing our voyage, but the silence was unbroken, and now the men stood with eyes cast down. And yet I had not once pronounced the name of Dirk Peters, nor alluded to Dirk Peters' proposal. I was asking myself whether I had or had not succeeded in inspiring my companions with my own belief, when Captain Len Guy spoke. "Dirk Peters," he said, "do you assert that Arthur Pym and you, after your departure from Tsalal Island, saw land in the direction of the south?" "Yes, land," answered the half breed. "Islands or continents, understand me. And I believe that Pym, poor Pym, is waiting there until aid comes to him." "There, where perhaps William Guy and his companions are also waiting," said I, to bring back the discussion to more practical points. Captain Len Guy reflected for a little while, and then spoke. "Is it true, Dirk Peters," he asked, "that beyond the 84th parallel the horizon is shut in by that curtain of vapour which is described in the narrative? Have you seen with your own eyes, those cataracts in the air, that gulf in which Arthur Pym's boat was lost?" The half breed looked from one to the other of us, and shook his big head. "I don't know," he said. "What are you asking me about, captain? A curtain of vapour? Yes, perhaps, and also appearances of land towards the south." Evidently Dirk Peters had never read Edgar Poe's book, and very likely did not know how to read. After having handed over Pym's journal, he had not troubled himself about its publication. Having retired to Illinois at first, and to the Falklands afterwards, he had no notion of the stir that the work had made, or of the fantastic and base-line climax to which our great poet had brought those strange adventurers. And besides, might not Arthur Pym himself, with his tendency to the supernatural, have fancied that he saw these wondrous things, due solely to his imaginative brain? Then, for the first time in the course of this discussion, West's voice made itself heard. I had no idea which side he would take. The first words he uttered were, "Captain, your orders?" Captain Len Guy turned towards his crew, who surrounded him, both the old and the new. Hearne remained in the background, ready to intervene if he should think it necessary. The captain questioned the boatswain and his comrades, whose devotion was unreservedly his, by a long and anxious look, and I heard him mutter between his teeth, "Ah, if it depended only on me, if I were sure of the assent and the help of them all!" Then Hearne spoke roughly. "Captain," said he, "it is 2 months since we left the Falklands. Now my companions were engaged for a voyage which was not to take them further beyond the icebergs than Tsalal Island." "That is not so!" exclaimed Captain Len Guy. "No, that is not so. I recruited you all for an enterprise which I have a right to pursue so far as I please." "Beg pardon," said Hearne coolly, "but we have come to a point which no navigator has ever yet reached, in a sea no ship except the Jane has ever ventured into before us, and therefore my comrades and I mean to return to the Falklands before the bad season. From there you can return to Tsalal Island, and even go on to the Pole if you so please." A murmur of approbation greeted his words. No doubt the sealing master justly interpreted the sentiments of the majority, composed of the new recruits. To go against their opinion, to exact the obedience of these ill-disposed men, and under such conditions to risk the unknown Antarctic waters, would have been an act of temerity, or rather an act of madness, that would have brought about some catastrophe. Nevertheless, West, advancing upon Hearne, said to him in a threatening tone, "Who gave you leave to speak?" "The captain questioned us," replied Hearne. "I had a right to reply." The man uttered these words with such insolence that West, who was generally so self-restrained, was about to give free vent to his wrath, when Captain Len Guy, stopping him by a motion of his hand, said quietly, "Be calm, Jem. Nothing can be done unless we are all agreed. What is your opinion, Hurliguerly?" "It is very clear, captain," replied the boatswain. "I will obey your orders, whatever they may be. It is our duty not to forsake William Guy and the others so long as any chance of saving them remains." The boatswain paused for a moment, while several of the sailors gave unequivocal signs of approbation. "As for what concerns Arthur Pym—" "There is no question of Arthur Pym," struck in the captain, "but only of my brother William and his companions." I saw at this moment that Dirk Peters was about to protest, and caught hold of his arm. He shook with anger, but kept silence. The captain continued his questioning of the men, desiring to know by name all those upon whom he might reckon. The old crew to a man acquiesced in his proposals, and pledged themselves to obey his orders implicitly, and follow him whithersoever he chose to go. 3 only of the recruits joined those faithful seamen. These were English sailors. The others were of Hearne's opinion, holding that for them the campaign was ended at Tsalal Island. They therefore refused to go beyond that point, and formally demanded that the ship should be steered northward, so as to clear the icebergs at the most favourable period of the season. 20 men were on their side, and to constrain them to lend a hand to the working of the ship if she were to be diverted to the south, would have been to provoke them to rebel. There was but one resource to arouse their covetousness, to strike the chord of self-interest. I intervened, therefore, and addressed them in a way which placed the seriousness of my proposal beyond a doubt. "Men of the Halbrane, listen to me. Just as various states have done for voyages of discovery in the polar regions, I offer a reward to the crew of this schooner. $2,000 shall be shared among you for every degree we make beyond the 84th parallel. Nearly $70 to each man. This was a strong temptation. I felt that I had hit the mark. "I will sign an agreement to that effect," I continued, "with Captain Len Guy as your representative, and the sums gained shall be handed to you on your return, no matter under what conditions that return be accomplished." I waited for the effect of this promise, and, to tell the truth, I had not long to wait. "Hurrah!" cried the boatswain, acting as fugleman to his comrades, who almost unanimously added their cheers to his. Hearne offered no further opposition. It would always be in his power to put in his word when the stances should be more propitious. Thus the bargain was made, and, to gain my ends, I have made a heavier sacrifice. It is true we were within 7 degrees of the south, and if the Halbrane should indeed reach that spot, it would never cost me more than $14,000. Early in the morning of the 27th of December, the Halbrane put out to sea, heading south-west. After the scene of the preceding evening, Captain Len Guy had taken a few hours' rest. I met him the next day on deck, while West was going about fore and aft, and he called us both to him. "Mr. Jeorling," he said, "it was with a terrible pang that I came to the resolution to bring our schooner back to the north. I felt I had not done all I ought to do for our unhappy fellow countrymen, but I knew that the majority of the crew would be against me if I insisted on going beyond Tsalal Island." "That is true, captain. There was a beginning of indiscipline on board, and perhaps it might have ended in a revolt." "A revolt we should have speedily put down," said West, coolly, "were it only by knocking Hearne, who is always exciting the mutinous men, on the head." "And you would have done well, Jem," said the captain. "Only justice being satisfied, what would have become of the agreement together, which we must have in order to do anything? Of course, captain, it is better that things passed off without violence, but for the future Hearne will have to look out for himself." "His companions," observed the captain, "are now greedy for the prizes that have been promised them. The greed of gain will make them more willing and persevering. The generosity of Mr. Jeorling has succeeded where our entreaties would undoubtedly have failed. I thank him for it." Captain Len Guy held out a hand to me, which I grasped cordially. After some general conversation relating to our purpose, the ship's course, and the proposed verification of the bearings of the group of islands on the west of Tsalal, which is described by Arthur Pym, the captain said: "As it is possible that the ravages of the earthquake did not extend to this group, and that it may still be inhabited, we must be on our guard in approaching the bearings." "Which cannot be far off," I added. "And then, captain, who knows but that your brother and his sailors might have taken refuge on one of these islands?" This was admissible, but not a consoling eventuality, for in that case the poor fellows would have fallen into the hands of those savages of whom they were rid while they remained at Tsalal. "Jem," resumed Captain Len Guy, "we are making good way, and no doubt land will be signalled in a few hours. Give orders for the watch to be careful." "It's done, captain." "There's a man in the crow's nest?" "Dirk Peters himself, at his own request." "All right, Jem. We may trust his vigilance." "And also his eyes," I added, "for he is gifted with amazing sight." For 2 hours of quick sailing, not the smallest indication of the group of 8 islands was visible. "It is incomprehensible that we could not come in sight of them," said the captain. "I reckon that the Halbrane has made 60 miles since this morning, and the islands in question are tolerably close together." "Then, captain, we must conclude, and it is not unlikely, that the group to which Tsalal belonged has entirely disappeared in the earthquake." "Land ahead!" cried Dirk Peters. We looked, but could discern nothing on the sea, nor was it until a quarter of an hour had elapsed that our glasses enabled us to recognize the tops of a few scattered islets shining in the oblique rays of the sun 2 or 3 miles to the westward. What a change! How had it come about? Arthur Pym described spacious islands, but only a small number of tiny islets, half a dozen at most, protruded from the waters. At this moment the half-breed came sliding down from his lofty perch and jumped to the deck. "Well, Dirk Peters, have you recognized the group?" asked the captain. "The group?" replied the half-breed, shaking his head. "No, I have only seen the tops of 5 or 6 islets. There is nothing but stone heaps there, not a single island." As the schooner approached we easily recognized these fragments of the group, which had been almost entirely destroyed on its western side. The scattered remains formed dangerous reefs, which might seriously injure the keel or the sides of the Halbrane, and there was no intention of risking the ship's safety among them. We accordingly cast anchor at a safe distance, and a boat was lowered for the reception of Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, Dirk Peters, Holt, 2 men, and myself. The still, transparent water, as Peters steered us skilfully between the projecting edges of the little reefs, allowed us to see, not a bed of sand strewn with shells, but heaps which were overgrown by land vegetation, tufts, plants not belonging to the marine flora that floated on the surface of the sea. Presently we landed on one of the larger islets, which rose to about 30 feet above the sea. "Do the tides rise sometimes to that height?" I inquired of the captain. "Never," he replied, "and perhaps we shall discover some remains of the vegetable kingdom, of habitations, or of an encampment." "The best thing that we can do," said the boatswain, "is to follow Dirk Peters, who has already distanced us. The half-breed's lynx's eyes will see what we can't." Peters had indeed scaled the eminence in a moment, and we presently joined him on the top. The islet was strewn with the remains, probably of those domestic animals mentioned in Arthur Pym's journal, but these bones differed from the bones on Tsalal Island by the fact that the heaps dated from a few months only. This, then, agreed with the recent period at which we placed the earthquake. Besides, plants and tufts of flowers were growing here and there. "And these are this year's," I cried. "No southern winter has passed over them." These facts having been ascertained, no doubt could remain respecting the date of the cataclysm after the departure of Patterson. The destruction of the population of Tsalal, whose bones lay about the village, was not attributable to that catastrophe. William Guy and the 5 sailors of the Jane had been able to fly in time, since no bones that could be theirs had been found on the island. Where had they taken refuge? This was the ever pressing question. What answer were we to obtain? Must we conclude that having reached one of these islets, they had perished in the swallowing up of the archipelago? We debated this point, as may be supposed, at a length and with detail which I can only indicate here. Suffice it to say that a decision was arrived at to the following effect. Our sole chance of discovering the unfortunate castaways was to continue our voyage for 2 or 3 parallels further. The goal was there, and which of us would not sacrifice even his life to attain it? "God is guiding us, Mr. Jeorling," said Captain Len Guy. Chapter 17.